Hi, this is John Swin. It's been a while. I hope all of you are doing well. For those who don't know, I'm an independent researcher working in the public's interest. I try my best to share things I find of interest and key dot-connecting pieces of information using various mediums. I make infographics and documentary videos. I also publish a lot of information on my website, exposetheenemy.com. I think today most people watching or listening to this will have never heard of the vast majority of groups and information I'll be covering, so it'll be worth sticking around to consume this information if you wish to enrich your mind or blow it. So as I said, my website is exposetheenemy.com. That's all one word. I have a YouTube channel at exposetheenemy. That is all one word. I have a couple of backup channels on Odyssey and Rumble. I have a Twitter account, but the place has gone to the dogs by design, so I hope to get more into that at a future date. So I'm going to be starting off by going through some infographics that I've recently created based on information I've been able to piece together. So please bear with me while I lay out and explain this information. So for those who are familiar with the content I've created previously, will be aware of a documentary series, The Unauthorized History of the American Century. There will be a lot of information that threads with that. The person to be covered in this part is Tom Braden, and a lot of background information parallels with the Henry Luce's American Century part of a documentary series regarding the OSS, that's the Office of Strategic Service, the CIA, and Operation Mockingbird. Tom Braden was an American CIA official, journalist, and co-host of the CNN show Crossfire. When the United States entered the war, that's World War II, he was recruited by the OSS and was parachuted behind enemy lines into Nazi-occupied France. At the end of the war, with the encouragement of OSS Director Wild Bill Donovan, who thought of Braden as a protege. Now that's pretty important if you know the significance of Donovan. Braden and his OSS friend Stuart Alsop wrote a journalistic book about the OSS. Braden later moved to Washington, D.C. and became part of a group of well-connected former OSS men such as Alan Dulles, and some of whom were journalists such as the Alsop brothers, known as the Georgetown Set. Braden began staunchly advocating for a permanent civilian intelligence agency that would become the CIA. Upon the founding of the CIA, Alan Dulles invited Braden to become his personal assistant. Braden set up a new International Organizations Division, IOD, under the Department Director of Plans, DDP, and that position was occupied by Frank Wisner. IOD oversaw the Culture Cold War and played a significant role in Operation Mockingbird. The IOD directly, with their fronts and agreeable foundations, funded prestigious journals, organised conferences, music competitions, and art exhibitions. The rationale behind this covert philanthropy was that American avant-garde culture that was both leftist and anti-communist could be an effective foil against Stalinist communism. Subsequently, Braden's efforts were guided towards promoting anti-Soviet left-wing elements in groups such as the AFL-CIO, which stands for the American Federation of Labour Congress of Industrial Organizations, which is a CIA front operating as a labour union. The CIA made the leap towards recruiting disaffected anti-Soviet ex-communists, especially in international labour unions. On the topic of the Rockefellers' relationship with the CIA, Braden said, "David Rockefeller was a friend and confidant of Dulles, and in some instances furnished a CIA front group. I remember briefing him in great detail about the work of the division that I headed in the CIA. Alan asked me to brief him, and I gave him a full briefing so that he knew everything that I was doing. And I think he did it with other division chiefs too. He was involved in intelligence work much closer than Nelson was. After CIA's covert work involving the National Student Association was exposed, Braden defended the CIA in an article titled "I'm glad the CIA is, quote, immoral" in the Saturday Evening Post. Now here are some infographics showing the key figures who were part of the OSS, Georgetown Set, CIA and Operation Mockingbird. Operation Mockingbird is a CIA operation that began in the early years of the Cold War and attempted to manipulate domestic American news media organizations for propaganda purposes. So now we're going to talk about the relationship between Tom Braden and Pat Buchanan. The two men hosted the Buchanan-Braden program, a 3-hour radio show from 1978 to 1984. They also hosted the CNN program Crossfire at the show's inception in 1982. Braden played the establishment liberal CIA, a Rockefeller Kennedy man, and Buchanan played the conservative CIA, a Goldwater Nixon man. The control narratives and outline of the debates mirror the Cold War activities Braden was involved in throughout his CIA career. Knowing Braden's history as head of the IOD, his role in the Georgetown Set, Operation Mockingbird, and anti-communist propaganda, his role as a TV personality was to install and reaffirm key establishment propaganda developed by the CIA to the public. Braden played a key role in establishing the liberal CIA via Operation Mockingbird that was presented to the public as the left wing. This helped to silence the real left and any legitimate criticism that would challenge corporate power that dominates the establishment. Another consequence was a shift of the US political spectrum towards the right. Okay, so now we're going to discuss the relationship between Pat Buchanan, Larry Pratt, and Alex Jones. Pat Buchanan. Buchanan was an assistant and special consultant to US Presidents Richard Nixon, Gerald Ford, and Ronald Reagan. He is an influential figure in the modern paleoconservative movement in America. Prior to suspending Larry Pratt from his position as co-chair of his 1996 presidential campaign, both Pat Buchanan and Pratt angrily denied allegations of Pratt's ties to white supremacist groups, and at a debate among the GOP candidates, Buchanan pledged to, quote, stand by his aide. He's being attacked because he supports me, unquote. I would urge the gun owners of New Hampshire and America to stand with Larry Pratt and stand with me, unquote. In the weeks following the Sandy Hook massacre, Buchanan published an op-ed called Pat Buchanan, America's Coming Gun War, in which he opposed any introduction of gun control measures. Larry Pratt. Pratt was co-chair of Pat Buchanan's 1996 presidential campaign. Pratt was forced to resign as co-chairman of Buchanan's campaign when it was publicised that he had been a speaker at a 1992 gathering of Christians where he rubbed shoulders with neo-Nazis, Klansmen, and adherents of Christian identity theology. Among the 160 Etz Park attendees were Aryan Nations leader Richard Butler and former Aryan ambassador and Ku Klux Klan leader Louis Beam. Many analysts see that meeting as crucial to the formation of a militia or, quote, patriot movement that would explode nationally in 1994. According to the University of Chicago's Dr. Kathleen Belew, Pratt called for small paramilitary units to violently resolve social problems such as drug use, interracial marriage, and the abortion of white babies, unquote. Pratt's authored a book entitled Armed People Victorious. That book is thought to have introduced the concept of civilian militias to the radical right. It included a detailed study of the, quote, citizen defense patrols, unquote, used in Guatemala and the Philippines against communist rebels, murderously brutal patrols that came to be nominally described as death squads. Pratt's speech in Etz Park offered a scenario for how similar militias could be organized in the United States. Alex Jones, American host of The Alex Jones Show and owner of infamous website Infowars.com. Jones has made a career of making fired-up wild rambling rants and promoting outlandish claims. During his long career on the air, Larry Pratt has appeared many times as a guest. Both men participated in shows that stoked gun control paranoia, pushing the notion that the massacre at Sandy Hook was somehow manufactured or a hoax perpetrated by the Obama administration as a pretext to push gun control legislation. The Obama administration did not create any new gun control measures, which, that alone, refutes that narrative. Speaking about his friend, Buchanan, Jones said the following, quote,
"When you get in the arena, you get stronger, folks. I've been in the arena, forged in the fires of grassroots warfare against tyranny and control freaks and scum jellyfish everywhere for 19 years. 2 years before that, in the proto-Tea Party libertarian movement. I went and put out yard signs for Pat Buchanan. I went out and knocked on doors and canvassed."
Alex Jones wants you to believe he's fighting tyranny, but he is working with his friends to assist it and cover it up by distracting attention away from the very information covered here. On another occasion, Jones said,
"I know Pat Buchanan personally, worked on his campaign 3 different times. I respect Pat Buchanan. He's a good paleo-conservative, libertarian, constitutionalist."
I'm now going to cover Larry Pratt in more detail. Larry Pratt, described as the gun lobby's secret weapon, Pratt is known for lobbying for absolutely unrestricted distribution of firearms while advocating a theocratic society based upon Old Testament civil and religious laws. Pratt's worldview is heavily influenced by the tenets of Christian Reconstructionism. Pratt holds the power to derail and delay gun legislation, enjoying broad public support, and quickly inject falsehoods and amplify paranoia among a growing network of gun activists. With the rise of the Tea Party scene, Pratt has discovered new constituencies and new platforms for spreading his message of a biblical mandated rollback of all gun regulation. He has also found new champions in the forms of his favourite senators Rand Paul and Ted Cruz. Now I'm going to touch on Pratt's connections to ALEC, ALEC. Pratt served as the chairman of American Legislative Exchange Council, Alumni Committee. Pratt's relationship with the American Legislation Exchange Council began in 1978 with ALEC's efforts to oppose a constitutional amendment giving full congressional representation to DC residents. ALEC formed an alliance with Pratt's Gun Owners of America in 1979 to develop a plan to prevent ratification of the amendment, which involved states sending formal resolutions of disapproval to the federal government. Pratt was quoted as saying, "The amendment would bring in 2 senators who would probably be minority and would definitely be liberal on gun control," unquote. In 1981, Pratt was elected as the Virginia state legislator, took on a leadership position in ALEC, sitting on ALEC's board and serving as treasurer into the 1980s, even after he left the legislature. Pratt's Gun Owners of America was an ALEC member into the 1990s. ALEC is a largely corporate-backed legislative powerhouse. Through ALEC, behind closed doors, corporations and state legislators for changes to the law they desire that directly benefits their bottom line. Along with legislators, corporations have membership in ALEC. Corporations sit on all 9 ALEC task forces and vote with legislators to approve, quote, model bills. They have their own corporate governing board, which meets jointly with the legislative board. Participating legislators, overwhelmingly conservative Republicans, then bring those proposals home and introduce them in state houses across the land as their own ideas, without disclosing corporations crafted and voted on the bills. Gun Owners of America. During his nearly 40-year tenure as Executive Director of Gun Owners of America, Larry Pratt has positioned the organization as a more radical alternative to the National Rifle Association. This radicalism is reflected not only by the absolute, quote, no compromise, unquote, stance on gun control, but also by Pratt's ties to the militia movement, white supremacist organizations, and Christian theocrats. Nonetheless, with the support of the GOA's 300,000 members and a Beltway lobbying effort, Pratt continues to be heeded by some in Congress and the national media. Under Pratt's leadership, GOA has steadfastly opposed any effort to restrict the ownership and availability of firearms. Although it is small compared to NRA's 4 million members, GOA's outsized influence helped push the NRA into opposing proposals such as universal background checks for all gun purchases, which the NRA supported until 1999. The Council for National Policy. The CNP is a secretive member organisation that plans the strategy of the religious right and self-proclaimed conservatives in the United States. Both Larry Pratt and Morton Blackwell have been long-term members of the group. Blackwell sits on the CNP Board of Governors and is their executive director. Leadership Institute is a right-wing Virginia-based training organisation for potential conservative political leaders. LI was founded in 1979 by its president, Morton Blackwell. Pratt had spoken at LI many times, providing legislative updates on the politics of guns. LI teaches conservatives of all ages how to succeed in politics, government and media by providing training in campaigns, fundraising, organising, communications and youth politics. LI offers 47 types of training schools, workshops and seminars, a free employment placement service and a national field programme that trains conservative students to organise campus groups. In 1979, LI has trained more than 183,000 conservative activists, leaders and students. The Institute's unique college campus network has grown to more than 1,700 conservative campus groups and newspapers. The Leadership Institute is an associate member of the State Policy Network. There is a revolving door between the Leadership Institute and Young Americans for Freedom, where Pat Buchanan was a long-time executive. Okay, now that I've laid out all that information clearly, I'm going to now walk you through how the liberal CIA and the conservative religious right control counterpart work together in this case study. So going back to Tom Braden's role in the CIA front, AFL-CIO. The AFL-CIO was a major component of the New Deal coalition that dominated politics in the mid-1960s. Although it has lost membership, finances and political clout since 1970, it remains a major player on the liberal side of national politics, with a great deal of activity and lobbying, grassroots organising, coordinating with other liberal organisations, fundraising and recruiting and supporting candidates around the country. Tom Braden's efforts were guided towards promoting anti-Soviet left-wing elements in groups such as the AFL-CIO. So we see how the main organisation operates domestically in the United States. Now, the American Institute for Free Labor Development was an IFL-CIO organization whose purpose was to undermine foreign unions. It received funding from the US government, mostly through USAID, that's the United States Agency for International Development, and starting in the 1980s, it began receiving funds from the NED. Needless to say, the American Institute for Free Labor Development has close ties to the CIA. The CIA made the leap towards recruiting disaffected anti-Soviet ex-communists, especially in international labour unions. The AIFLD most often concentrated on union officials in labour unions, both paying them off as well as, quote, training them. The organisation was created in 1962. A US Comptroller's General's report says in May 1961, the AFL-CIO approached private foundations, businessmen and government agencies to seek financing for the planned institute. One of the foundations it applied to was the Michigan Fund, identified by congressional sources as a conduit for CIA money. AIFLD found welcome open pockets in the business group. George Meany, president of the AFL-CIO, and also of AIFLD, boasted support from, quote, the largest corporations in the United States: Rockefeller, ITT, Standard Oil, Shell Petroleum, Anaconda, even Reader's Digest. And although some other companies have no connection whatsoever to US trade unions, they are all agreed that it was really in the US interest to help develop free trade unions in Latin America, and that's why they contributed so much money, unquote. J. Peter Grace, chairman of the board of AIFLD and also chairman of the board of W.R. Grace Corporation, one of the 95 transnational companies that back the Institute, applies the doctrine in tactical terms. Grace says that AIFLD urges, quote, cooperation between labour and management and an end to class struggle, unquote, unquote, teaches workers to increase their company's business, unquote. He says the goal of the Institute is to, quote, prevent communist infiltration, and where it exists, get rid of it, unquote. This is the guy who was president and American chapter board of founders of the American Association of the Sovereign Military Order of the Knights of Malta. He oversaw the order's operational assistance of the El Salvadorian military-led Junta government in the country's civil war. He was also a member of the Council for National Policy, the Council on Foreign Relations, and the Pilgrim Society. He was the chairman of America's Advisory Committee. The organisation was used by a handful of extremely wealthy corporate rulers to combat those fighting for basic union rights and national self-determination. He also played a prominent role in the organisation of a fascist coup that overthrew the Allende government in Chile. He was associated with CIA fronts and the Galen organisation, linked Radio Liberty and Radio Free Europe. He's said to be involved in Operation Paperclip and sought out German scientists for employment at R.W. Grace & Co. chemical company. A less optimistic but more realistic appraisal of AIFLD's role is given by Phil Agnew in his book Inside the Company. Speaking of its creation in 1962, he states that AIFLD is, quote, Washington's answer to the limitations of current labour programs undertaken through AID, as well as through ORIT and CIA stations, unquote. The problem, says Agnew, was, quote, how to accelerate expansion of labour organising activities in Latin America in order to deny workers to labour unions dominated by the extreme left and reverse communist and Castroite penetration, unquote. So we can see how this network of organisations operate to interfere and undermine foreign unions and their activities, thus interfering and applying political pressure in the domestic politics of the victim countries on the behest of multinational corporations that wish to exploit the labour and resources of fellow countries of the Americas. Now that this wing of organisations has been explained, now let's take a look at the example of the paramilitary wing. This will explore at some length the dimensions of Larry Pratt's ties to the national security state I will demonstrate that Pratt, Buchanan, and a host of others who present themselves as being, quote, outsiders or populists or agents and apologists for the global crimes of those behind what we know as US imperialism. The Council for Inter-American Security, CIS, played a pivotal role in formulating Washington's program for counter-revolutionary war and mass murder in Central America during the 1980s. Larry Pratt was a central figure within the CIS hierarchy, as was Pat Buchanan. Pratt was secretary to the group, while Buchanan functioned as an organization director. The organization was headed by Pratt's fellow CMP friend, Lynn Francis Bouchy. The CIS was more than a right-wing think tank researching and formulating foreign policy for the Reagan administration. The group functions as a dual capacity as an alarmist, quote, public policy institute, unquote, and as a domestic spy ring, a, quote, privatized version of the CIA's infamous COINTELPRO operations. Now, for those of you who are unaware, this sounds a little too familiar to me to Western Goals Foundation. I've covered more recent use of private intelligence in my video, quote, The Real Shadowgate. In my video, The Real Shadowgate, Global Oligarchy's Use of Private Intelligence. I've covered more recent use of private intelligence in my video, The Real Shadowgate, Global Oligarchy's Use of Private Intelligence, and I have a good understanding of it historically as well from my extensive research I've done to make the Unauthorized History of the American Century documentary series. This private domestic spy ring element of a CIS sounds a lot like the American Security Council. It actually formed as an acquisition of other groups, and one of which was called American Vigilante Intelligence Federation. That was founded in 1927 and was operated by a private investigator called Harry A. Young, that's Jung, out of Chicago. The group had acquired and produced an enormous amount of files and compiled dossiers on all of those they suspected of being leftists. Anyway, with this private data, the American Security Council established the Mid-America Research Library. The objective of this organization was to store all the acquired data and continue to compile files on those they suspected of being communists who might apply for jobs in the private sector. This blacklist, that included 6 million people's names, was provided to 3,500 companies. So the American Security Council with the Mid-America Research Library worked very closely with the FBI and the House Un-American Activities Committee. And this private intelligence link to Chicago isn't alone. Thinking about it now with these groups is that they were likely working in tandem as part of a private intelligence network to acquire all this information. Another one of America's oldest private spy rings was called Church League of America. It was founded in Chicago as well in 1937 to oppose left-wing and social gospel influences in Christian thought that was spreading throughout the country. The CLA became an influential anti-communist research and advocacy group in the 1950s under the direction of former US Air Force intelligence officer Major Edgar C. Bundy. General Robert Wood, a former chairman of the board of Sears Roebuck & Co., was a founder of the American Security Council and financed the CLA. In 1961, the Church League moved its headquarters to Wheaton, Illinois, where it continued its research operations and created an extensive library of materials on subversive activity. Selling reports and access to its information was a major source of revenue for the Church League, and they also sometimes provided it without charge to like-minded researchers, including members of government and law enforcement agencies. There's also a connection between the CLA and Western Goals Foundation via John Rees, that's R-E-E-S. So we can assume that these private intelligence groups mentioned have had access to, contributed to, and developed this massive database. And I'll get into some of the planned usage of this database by Larry Pratt and his militia network later on. Now getting back to Larry Pratt's CIS. One of their objectives was to target Central America solidarity activists, progressive clergy, and the Salvadorian exile community. One of the objectives mentioned at the founding of the Church League of America was to oppose social gospel influences in Christian thought in organisations. We can see how these practices have been carried out domestically, have been expanded internationally as part of this network's policy. CIS gathered intelligence and disseminated disinformation, funneling data on foreign policy opponents to the FBI and the intelligence service of the Salvadorian death squad state. Now think about how all these files, full of compiled data being computerized, and how it can be used with software such as PROMIS and its successor software across intelligence services, taking into consideration this clip.
Regions like Latin America, other places, are so basically unfair. There are so few people who are inordinately wealthy, so many people who have no hope at all. And it's worse now in Latin America. I can hardly believe it, but it's worse now in Latin America than it was when I went down there 32 years ago in 1960, at the end of the Eisenhower administration. It is worse now even than it was then, and then it was appalling. The CIA will, in other words, be working with the security and intelligence services of other countries. And one way they're going to be doing it is through high technology. There's a book on the table back there by Ari Ben-Menashe. It just came out 3 weeks ago. It is called The Prophets of War. Ben-Menashe was an officer in the Israeli military intelligence service for 12 years. And he was involved at the highest level in some very, very interesting things. It is probably the most sensational book that's come out this year, although it is not receiving the proper attention it deserves in the U.S. information media. But Ben-Menashe, it's a very long story who he is and the controversy surrounding him for the last 2 or 3 years. But one of the things we owe to him is gratitude for having outlined how the PROMIS software developed by the Inslaw company was marketed around the world to intelligence and security services. When I was in the agency, I was in charge in 2 Latin American countries of what we called first the links list. Links as in the animal. The links list was a series of files on all of the most important political activists of the left in the host country. I did it first in Ecuador and then in Uruguay, but all the countries of Latin America, and I'm sure all the third world countries, had the requirement on the CIA stations, which came from headquarters, to keep this list up to date. What it amounted to were files on the individuals, names, place and date of birth, biographic information, in other words, synopsis of the political activity of the person, which was constantly being updated, up-to-date photograph, where the family lived, where the man or woman worked, where the spouse worked, where children went to school, where they took their leisure activities, where they are liable to go to hide in a period of crisis, all of those things. And some officer, in my case I was a junior officer at the time, I had to keep these different files up to date, and it was all in Spanish for quick turnover to the local police and security authorities so that these people could be rounded up en masse. And we used this information in Ecuador, for one example, in 1963 when a whole series of our operations came to fruition, as they should have, and resulted in a military coup against the elected civilian government. There was a military junta immediately in place, and we were turning over this information, I was, to the local security authorities. That was one of my jobs. And they, in turn, were rounding up people by the hundreds and putting them in jail. Very similar information would have been used in Chile in the aftermath of the Pinochet coup in 1973, and there could be many more examples. In El Salvador during the 1980s, I'm certain that this was done by the CIA with the Salvadoran security forces. Well, what I was doing in the 60s was all by hand. It was before computers, or certainly before microcomputers, and the development of the software to make it all computerized. But in the late 1960s, a man named Bill Hamilton in the National Security Agency developed a program for use in tracking people. And he left the National Security Agency, took over a nonprofit company named Inslaw. Many of you will have been following the Inslaw scandal. And he further developed and enhanced this program called PROMIS. P-R-O-M-I-S stands for Prosecutor's Management Information System. And he then sold it to the Justice Department. Justice took it, refused to pay him. There was a court suit that followed, and I'm not going to go into the details, because what is important is that this program was a development of what I was doing with the links list, or what was later known as, the name changed to Subversive Control Watch List. And Ben Menashe writes in his book how the Israelis got this program from Earl Bryan, the former Secretary of Health Services here in California during the Reagan period as governor. Bryan was marketing it around the world. The Israelis also marketed it around the world through another so-called private individual, i.e. Robert Maxwell, the tycoon who owned the mirror interests in Britain, and who later was killed. Ben Menashe is certain that he was killed, that he didn't commit suicide when he fell off his yacht. But in any case, what happens is the Israelis provide this software to the Guatemalan government in 1984. What does this system do? It means that disparate databases can all be made to interface, and that the formats can be made compatible through this very high-tech advanced software. It means that for a list of individuals, everything about them can be put into the same computer program, from the water company lists to the telephone company records to the electric company records, all the utilities, bank records, travel records, for example, all the airline reservation systems, trains, buses, everything you can imagine. And of course the national identity registration documents. In Guatemala, in order to make this work, they got new IBM computers, and they did a new census of the whole country, and they issued a new system of identity card, identity document. Then they trained the security forces and the Army to use a very elementary computer terminal, which they installed all over the country, and in bus stations, at airports, even roadblocks in the most remote places. And this was the period of the greatest political repression in Guatemala in history. It was the period of the general Mejia Victorez, who was calling himself president at the time. Well, the Israelis and the CIA created trapdoors into this program. Trapdoors meaning a way through modems in which they could have access to the computers of the host intelligence or security service. They tried it first with the Jordanians, and as soon as it was installed through the trapdoor program, the Israelis were reading all the files of the Jordanian military intelligence service. And of course, the principal target of the Jordanians were the Palestinians, which were the Israelis' principal targets. And so they were able to collect an enormous amount of information by monitoring what the Jordanians were doing through this PROMIS software.
Don't for a second think that this network don't want to create the same system with death squads domestically. I'm not joking. After all, it was Larry Pratt who, in his book Armed People Victorious, he introduced this concept of introducing the death squads. Also, a former FBI agent named Paul Rothermale, who was hired by the ultra-rightist Hunt family, that's the H.L. Hunt family in Texas. Rothermale was convinced that Nelson Bunker Hunt was prepared to kill him after he refused to participate in what he said was Hunt's intention to establish an American version of the Brazilian death squads that would be used to terrorize the American left by means of paramilitary killer force he supposedly had begun to establish in Southern California. I want to remind you that during this time period of aiding the Contras, the domestic side of the illegal CIA Contra operations were aided by the Hunt family. According to journalist Ross Gelspan, a private group which flourished during the Reagan era was a Washington-based Council for Inter-America Security. The group disseminated reams of material during the 1980s purporting to prove linkages between a Soviet-inspired global terror network and liberal and left-wing American groups opposed to US foreign policies. kind of reminds me of the exact situation with the overthrow of Arbenz in Guatemala. The CIA pushed the same narrative that Arbenz was part of a vast international conspiracy with the Soviets, and they used that in an attempt to justify the coup. Anyway, after the coup, the CIA launched Operation PB History, which saw evidence of Soviet influence in Guatemala among documents from the Arbenz era, but found none. CIS also expended considerable effort to improve the public image of the reputed Salvadorian death squad leader Roberto D'Orbison. When the FBI's committee, in solidarity with the people of El Salvador, files were pried open in 1988 by a lawsuit brought by the Center for Constitutional Rights, they were found to contain several reports written by J. Michael Waller, a researcher whose work had been sponsored by the Non-Governmental Council for Inter-American Security. In 1984, FBI court-active measures against CISPES and the Sanctuary Movement were in full swing. Now the CISPES, a committee in solidarity with the people of El Salvador. 15 bureau field offices, dozens of agents and hundreds of private right-wing intelligence assets were involved in these illegal operations. More than 200 incidences of harassment and intimidation against activists were documented. Many incidents involved church and office break-ins, theft of files, and the infiltration of local CISPES chapters of federal informants. Peaceful public rallies and demonstrations were disrupted by goons affiliated with Reverend Sun Young Moon's Collegiate Association of the Research of Principles, CARP. Though FBI informants could not produce a shred of evidence linking these groups to quote terrorism, the FBI actually increased the level of their attack. According to the logic of the Bureau Red Hunters, the lack of criminal activity in and of itself was demonstrable evidence of a quote broad quote conspiracy hatched by shrewd agents linked to the KGB. This was an illusion that the Council of Inter-American Security helped to create. Throughout the period, the FBI were fed reports alleging that CISPES was a quote terrorist organization. Waller, a research director and editor of the CIS journal West Watch, wrote a text with a fanciful title, CISPES, a terrorist propaganda network, unquote, that was given wide play by the media. However, because Mr. Waller's services produced the desired propaganda effect intended by his handlers, he secured several generous grants from the State Department's Latin American Office of Public Development. Recent American history is replete with examples of the profitability of lying in order to advance state interest. Prior to Reagan's 1980 election, CIS was the principal organization leading the charge for a quote activist foreign policy to quote defeat communism in Central America. In 1980, they published a new inter-American policy for the 80s, generally known as the quote Santa Fe document. Louis Tams, Santa Fe's principal author, would be appointed by Reagan as ambassador, first to Colombia and then to Costa Rica, the launching pad for Contra attacks into Nicaragua along the southern front. Other committee members involved in the production of the Santa Fe document included Roger Fontaine, a National Security Council advisor on Latin American affairs, retired Lieutenant General Gordon Sumner, who became Special Assistant to the Secretary of State for Latin American Affairs, and Lynn Francis Bouchy, an active organizer for the Unification Church Causa operations in Central and South America. Bouchy, the co-author of The Strategy of Terror, written with Stephen Pozzany, was a former member of the Young Americans for Freedom, where Pat Buchanan was an executive. She was also employed by the American Chilean Council, a front for the murderous Pinochet regime. Pozzany was a senior fellow at the Hoover Institute, was a long-time WACL operative, and a board member of Lyndon LaRouche's Fusion Energy Foundation, and was a founding member of CIS. As was Dr. Anthony Balskarian, a right-wing operative who worked for the Pioneer Fund. The Committee of Santa Fe alleged, among other things, that the US, quote, must seize the initiative or perish. World War III is almost over, unquote. CIS viewed the Soviet Union as an aggressor that was strangling the Western industrialized nations. Central America was described as, quote, the soft underbelly of the United States. The authors called for the, quote, restoration of the Monroe Doctrine as the linchpin of US regional strategy. In other words, the United States was free to pursue its regional interests unhindered. Bluntly, this meant that the internal politics of the Central American states were subject to, quote, review by the US, quote, correctives. Dictates from Washington would be applied as needed. As a practical necessity, such, quote, correctives included the destruction of the Cuban, Grenadian, and Nicaraguan revolutions and the maintenance of a, quote, the fundamental order of things, unquote, in Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. The committee wrote, America is everywhere in retreat. The impending loss of the petroleum of the Middle East and potential interdiction of sea routes spanning the Indian Ocean, along with the Soviet satellisation of the mineral zone of southern Africa, foreshadow the Finlandisation of Western Europe and the alienation of Japan. Even the Caribbean, America's maritime crossroads and petroleum refining centre, is becoming a Marxist-Leninist lake. It's funny because this document was published in 1988, 3 years before the Soviet Union collapsed, and at this time the USSR was imploding. Never before has the Republic been in such jeopardy from its exposed southern flank. Never before has American foreign policy abused, abandoned and betrayed its allies in the South and Latin America. It is time to sound a clarion call for freedom, dignity and national self-interest, which will echo the spirit of the American people. I'm not sure who this drivel is more offensive to, the people of Central and South America or United States citizens themselves. Though the authors freely employed alarmist rhetoric with little regard to the actual history of US regional domination, quote, Santa Fe was not the production of marginal right-wing kooks obsessed with the Red Menace. According to the Inter-Hemispheric Research Center, in the early years of the Reagan administration, the organization was one of the most influential think tanks of the new right, providing both policy and policy makers to the new administration. In the heyday of its influence, one observer noted top officials of CIS, quote, shuttled to and from key policy-making and advisory roles in the administration, unquote. Among those tapped for administration positions were Pat Buchanan, who became President Reagan's communication director. Buchanan marketed himself as an outsider standing up for the working man against a godless, secular, humanist cabal of multinational corporations, abortionists, feminists, homosexuals, immigration and socialist one-worlders, intent on imposing a new world order on the American people. The project was assisted by the media, who tossed his actual record down Orwellian memory hole. Doesn't that sound a lot like how Donald Trump was marketed to the public? CIS was engaged in a covert war against US leftist, progressive clergy and the Salvadoran exile community, channeling information gleaned by its operatives to the FBI and the Salvadoran national security apparatus. This too has a long history in the United States. Another significant source of support for the CIS and a host of other, quote, conservative organisations was Reverend Sun Myung Moon's Unification Church. Lynn Francis Bouchey helped organise 2 conferences for Causa, led by another retired general, E. David Woolner. In 1981, Bouchey was, quote, specially commissioned by Moon's World Media Institute to prepare and present a, quote, content analysis of media coverage of US policy in El Salvador. Active chapters of Moon's organisation existed throughout the region. The largest affiliates were centred in Argentina, Bolivia, Brazil and Paraguay. In Brazil, the director of Causa said, quote, we are forming the future base for a political party though at present we are still apolitical. We want to form a movement like Le Pen's in France. Needless to say, French fascist Jean Le Pen and his daughter Marine Le Pen have done just that with a national front, with significant financial backing from the Moon Network. But Moon's extensive Latin American operations had a dual purpose, from construction of an anti-communist, quote, armed church and a, quote, unofficial link among CIA intelligence assets and the leaders of the death squad states. In Bolivia, these are neither incidental nor marginal connections. CIS served both as an intelligence conduit from, quote, private sources such as American Security Council and Causa, and as an informal employment agency which provided analysts to the Reagan administration at the inception of Washington's murderous counterinsurgency wars in Central America. As CIS Secretary Larry Pratt was a well-placed asset in his own right, serving as a link between the public policy research arm of the organizations, the interventionist wing of a theocratic Christian right, and as an informal public relations spokesperson for Washington's Central America agenda via Gun Owners of America and the CIS-affiliated North-South Institute. But in order to fully appreciate the sinister nature of the Council for Inter-American Security, Pratt's involvement, and his broader links to international fascist networks, there is another organization, also little explored by mainstream media, which deserves our attention: the World Anti-Communist League. The World Anti-Communist League was founded in 1966 by two close Asian allies of the United States, Taiwan and South Korea, and a third organization, Anti-Bolshevik Bloc of Nations, led by the Ukrainian war criminal Yaroslav Stetsko. In the United States, WACL's first chairman was Roger Pearson, a white supremacist eugenicist. Pearson was the editor of Willis Carto's Western Destiny, the forerunner of the Liberty Lobby Spotlight tabloid. By the mid-1970s, Pearson served on the editorial boards of both the Heritage Foundation and the American Security Council. Larry Pratt gave a speech at a testimonial banquet celebrating the 20th anniversary of Willis Carto's Spotlight magazine. I hope to cover that whole network as well in the near future. When Pearson became too hot to handle, he was forced to resign in 1980. With Pearson's departure, WACL was in crisis and in danger of disbanding. It's during this period that CIS board member John Singlaub came to the rescue, reorganizing WACL's American chapter. Singlaub has a long, bloody history of involvement with the formulation and execution of US counterinsurgency strategy and covert operations around the world. A member of the Office of Strategic Service at the end of World War II, Singlaub moved up the ladder, becoming CIA desk officer for China in 1949 and deputy station chief in Korea during the war. During the Vietnam War, he commanded the Special Operations Group, which implemented the CIA's Phoenix operation, responsible for the cold-blooded murder of some 40,000 Vietnamese and the imprisonment of hundreds of thousands of other Vietnamese in, quote, strategic hamlets, unquote. Singlaub was appointed head of the US command in South Korea in 1976, but was removed in 1978 when he publicly disagreed with President Carter's plan to withdraw US troops. A significant figure within the national security apparatus and the far right, Singlaub was well placed to serve as a contact who could network neo-fascist killers, drug peddlers, and state-sanctioned terrorist core assets employed by the national security state itself. In April 1984, Singlaub met with President Reagan and National Security Advisor Robert McFarlane and was named, quote, the chief fundraising contact, unquote, to the Contra army in Central America. With this choice, the president plucked from the world a man who had spent 6 years since his forced retirement from the army in some of the most powerful and dangerous organizations on the US and international extreme right. Reagan honored these with a warm greeting to WACL at its 1984 gathering, asserting that the organization was planning a, quote, leadership role in the, quote, gallant struggle being waged by the true freedom fighters of our day, unquote. Within a year at Bitburg, Reagan would pay his respects to the Waffen SS. It is within this context as well that Pat Buchanan, then Reagan's communication director, echoed calls issued by the Nazi-linked Captive Nations Committee to abolish the Justice Department's Office for Special Investigations, responsible for prosecuting war criminals still at large. This should not come as a shock to anyone, since many members of CNC held dual membership in WACL. Andy Messing, as well as Howard Phillips, former chairman of the Conservative Caucus and leader of the United States Taxpayers Party, were key figures within WACL's American branch. Larry Pratt shares Phillips's ideological commitments to the clerical fascist doctrine, Christian Reconstructionism. Pratt was a National Committee member of Phillips's United States Taxpayers Party. Phillips and other American far-rightists, including, were members of the South Africa lobby, the International Freedom Foundation, an organisation founded by convicted fraudster corrupt lobbyist Jack Abramoff, who was exposed by senior apartheid South African military personnel as a cutout of the South African military and special branch. IFF functioned as a propaganda arm, South African Stratcom, counterinsurgency operations directed against the African National Congress. These are some of the individuals found within Mr. Pratt's small circle of friends, but for quote reasons of state, the mainstream media has tended to forget the invaluable services rendered to imperialism by such extremist representatives of the radical religious right. We also have to take into account how CNN have platformed both Larry Pratt and Alex Jones with their debates with Piers Morgan in the wake of the Sandy Hook school shooting. That's the same network where Pat Buchanan and Tom Braden hosted Crossfire. I'll move on and talk about Larry Pratt, CIS, and the war on refugees / immigration. Fighting communism at home and abroad were not the only missions undertaken by the CIS, and with the collapse of the USSR, the anti-communist CIS quickly shifted their rhetoric as the facade of an ever-encroaching, all-powerful Soviet Union on the verge of global domination crumbled faster than the Berlin Wall, as did any credibility the organisation may have ever had. It was now time to blame the refugees, the poor migrant workers, the foreigners, the people of colour, the gays, basically anyone who wasn't a white fundamentalist Christian. All were always enemies of those behind CIS. It was just convenient to smear their enemies red with a broad brush. But the paint wasn't sticking, it was washing away. The propaganda lies of the Cold War were recycled for a new battleground. But the paint wasn't sticking, it was washing away. The propaganda lies of the Cold War were recycled for a new battleground, the culture war. All were always enemies of those behind CIS. It was just convenient to smear their enemies red with a broad brush. But the paint wasn't sticking, it was washing away. The propaganda lies of a Cold War needed a fresh coat of paint, and thus they were recycled for a new battlefront, the culture war. Mr. Pratt, presenting himself in the guise of a righteous defender of traditional family values and America's godly heritage, protecting the ever more persecuted Christian population from a flood of, quote, illegals, Christians, from south of the border. Yeah, Larry, this sounds stupid. Basically, Christians with different coloured skin were the big problem in Larry's life. Oh, and they spoke a different language than him. Pratt would use his skills as a propagandist and his position as President of Gun Owners of America to launch a new campaign to make English the official language of the United States. Under the auspices of CIS, Pratt was a president of an anti-immigration outfit called English First. Officers of Pratt's group are also leaders of the alarmist United States Border Control. Another connected group is the Denver-based North-South Institute, which is the non-profit arm of CIS. North-South Institute Director and President Lieutenant General Gordon Sumner was also a CIS director and an officer of the United States Border Control. A close ally of Pratt's in this enterprise is Anthony Bhaskaran, a CIS advisor along with Singlaub and Sumner. Bhaskaran was a board member of WACL's American branch. During the 1960s, he worked with Wycliffe Draper's Pioneer Fund. During the 1970s, Bhaskaran was a board member of the American Chilean Council, a group which served as a public relations arm of the Pinochet death squad state. Bhaskaran signed the quote Declaration of San Salvador as a proxy for John Singlaub. The declaration was a result of a right-wing conference held in San Salvador in 1985. It included many WACL members and focused on ways to involve civilians in anti-communist efforts. The document announced the formation of the Central American Anti-Communist Defense Accord, intended to create a combat group known as the Central American Civilian Military Alliance. But that was more of a WACL propaganda project, drawing on the experiences of Guatemala's notorious, quote, Program of Assistance of Areas in Conflict, unquote. WACL, CACMA, and the CIA handlers viewed these operations as a means of generalizing and standardizing the Guatemalan experience throughout the region. In the neo-genocidal enterprise against the Mayan people, the death squad regime was offered much assistance by Israeli as well as domestic assets within the US Christian right, especially the clerical fascist reconstructionist wing of the movement. The counterinsurgency doctrine, beginning in the early 1990s, veterans of CIA Contra operations and the intellectual architects began propagandizing for a systematic application of LIC methodology within the imperialistic heartland itself. The quote, war on drugs and the immigration naturalization services, brutal border sweeps, detention and deportation of so-called illegals, many of whom are political refugees, are but the tip of the iceberg in this regard. Echoing the xenophobic campaign already in full swing within the reunified Germany, CIS and English First issued a paper titled Creating a Hispanic America, Nation Within a Nation, ? This racist diatribe virtually equates bilingual education with, quote, terrorism. Quote, bilingual education has national security implications, unquote. The paper compares the US Southwest, French-speaking Quebec, with its potential for separation. It sees the Chicano and Spanish-speaking population as in themselves a threat to US national security and unity. The paper also indulges in more blatant racism. It describes the American Indian ancestors of Latinos as, quote, uncivilized barbaric squatters, unquote, with, quote, a penchant for grotesque human sacrifices, cannibalism, and kidnapping women, unquote. This is the ideology that guides English First leader Pratt in his fundraising appeals for the English-only cause. In one letter soliciting potential donors, Pratt claimed, quote, many immigrants these days are encouraged not to learn English. They remain stuck in a linguistic ghetto, living off welfare and costing working Americans billions of tax dollars, unquote. Larry Pratt is a key leader in the reactionary US Taxpayers Party. Pratt is a national committee member as well as a national co-chair of Pat Buchanan's campaign committee, as well as national co-chairman of Pat Buchanan's campaign committee. A central plank of the USTP's platform is the requirement that English becomes the, quote, official language of the United States. The USTP is opposed both to bilingual education and the use of multilingual ballots for US elections. That would be a form of voter suppression. But buried within the USTP's 1992 platform is a bland phrase. The USP, quote, rejects the practice of bestowing US citizenship on children born to illegal alien parents while in this country, unquote. This is an attack on the 13th and 14th Amendments to the US Constitution. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery, while the 14th Amendment granted full citizens' rights, former slaves, as well as to the children of non-citizen immigrants born in the US, legal or otherwise. In fact, Pratt and his cohort within the, quote, Patriot movement seek to repeal these amendments as part of a drive to create a, quote, Christian republic, unquote. The origins of, quote, patriot thinking regards constitutional, quote, revisions of citizens' rights. Mr. Pratt and his cohorts within the CIS have much to answer for in their service to US imperialism. Their role as active agents for murderous policies designed to bring the Central American people in line with the rule of law and the civilized norms of Western democracies have had very grave consequences indeed. Their close collaboration with the FBI and the Salvadoran Intelligence Service unquestionably resulted in the death of hundreds of refugees after their forced deportation to El Salvador. According to the Political Asylum Project of the American Civil Liberties Union, out of 154 refugees deported in 1983 and 1984, 42 returnees were killed, 7 were arrested, 5 were jailed, 47 were, quote, disappeared, and an additional 43 others, quote, disappeared under violent circumstances. Far from being an innocent wrongly accused of racism, Larry Pratt is an individual committed to a worldview which begins and ends with global economic, political, cultural, military domination by US imperialism. This is the context and ideology behind Pat Buchanan's allegiance to xenophobic, quote, American first nationalism. Mr. Pratt's 1990 book, On People Victorious, touted by the mainstream press, is a, quote, passionate defense, unquote, of gun rights and the militia movement, is a volume inspired by the anti-communist death squads which operated so, quote, efficiently in Guatemala and the Philippines. Pratt's close working relationship with the CSI and the Anti-Communist League provided him both with the theoretical and practical knowledge necessary to forge effective links among a host of individuals who actively sympathized with US-sponsored terror and mass murder in Central America. So in summary, this network destabilized the Americas, created, trained and supported death squads, supported dictators they helped to install. Then when the people lucky enough to escape that hell they created, some of which might be lucky enough to seek refuge in another country like the United States, they're used as political fodder by this network to complain about border control and demonize the refugees further. Domestically, this network used anti-refugee propaganda as a distraction from other issues and even pinned their own crimes on them. You see it all the time today, pinning the fentanyl crisis on refugees. During the Vietnam War, this network were financing their black operations through criminal activity involving illegal drugs. We did the same thing during Iran-Contra, and don't for a second believe they aren't doing it now. Then, through the mainstream media and alternative media, the agents create hysteria about immigration and the border, and they try to steer those issues into votes for their candidates at the local level, for Congress, the Senate, and the presidency. So the network maintains or grows in power and political influence. Ultimately, it is this network, their agents and allies, that have police a border, and they will do everything in their power to maintain and increase their control over it while voicing their concerns about it, requesting more money from the federal government, using their organizations such as CIS, FAIR, North-South Institute, United States Border Control, and the Federation of American Immigration Reform. And look at who benefits from the vulnerable refugees who come to the United States with nothing. We know what happens to the ones who politically organise. So in order to survive, they enter the labour market legally or illegally and are at risk of being exploited by criminals, corporations, or end up in the prison industrial complex. Their desperate situation creates the circumstances where they can be exploited to work for less or work longer hours or both. Sometimes it can be the same corporations financing this network or the same criminals linked to this network exploiting them. Also, the demonizing propaganda this network produces results in a decrease in support and bitterness towards them, making them more vulnerable and susceptible to exploitation. I'll leave it there for now. Thanks for tuning in. This has been John Swin. Take care.